The sun hung low over the white ramparts of King's Landing, staining the sky a bruise-colored purple, as if foreshadowing the violence yet to come. The air held a cloying humidity, thick with the stench of the city's waste and the sweat of its teeming populace. Over the past few days, the capital seemed to shift in tone. An undercurrent of tension rippled through the streets. Merchants cast wary glances at passing guards, fishermen kept their voices hushed along the piers, and even the gold cloaks themselves walked with a sense of unease, as though expecting the worst at any moment. Within the Red Keep, ominous whispers floated through the corridors, speaking of shadows in corners, hushed meetings behind locked doors, and the Lord Eddard Stark, who in these rumors had become a figure of both hope and dread. Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell and newly appointed Hand of the King, had always believed himself a straightforward man of honor. He had come to King's Landing months earlier, summoned by his old friend Robert Baratheon. Robert had wanted Ned by his side, for he believed only Ned could be trusted in a city where intrigue and cunning were weapons as sharp as any sword. Yet Robert's sudden death, on a hunt that many suspected was no accident, had thrown the Seven Kingdoms into chaos. The boy Joffrey Baratheon, fair-haired but cruel-eyed, had taken the throne, flanked by the proud and manipulative Queen Cersei. Rumors regarding Joffrey's true parentage only grew in volume and fervor. Many whispered that he was no son of Robert at all, but an abomination born of incest between Queen Cersei and her twin brother, Ser Jaime Lannister. To Ned's horror, King Joffrey wasted no time flaunting his cruelty, ordering executions and humiliations in the streets, dispensing twisted justice under the pretense of royal authority. The crown's coffers were spent, and the boy king's petulance only worsened the realm's debt. Noble houses raised eyebrows. Commoners, once indifferent to the wars of the highborn, now found themselves starving, harassed by brutes in golden cloaks, forced to kneel in corners and confess their loyalty to the new boy king. All the while, Ned's sense of honor, so absolute in the north, was battered daily in a city that worshipped secrets and half-truths. He had tried to save the boy's life once upon a time, at least from the truth. He had confronted Cersei with his findings, hoping she would flee with her children to spare the realm the bloodshed of a civil war. But the tides of circumstance had turned against him. Robert's death had come too soon, his will disregarded. Joffrey had taken the throne and demanded that Ned bend the knee, which he had refused to do. In that refusal, Ned was branded a traitor and nearly paid with his head. But unexpected intervention had bought him some time. Some quiet conversation, a promise from the City Watch that they would stand behind the realm's lawful government, and an understanding that Stannis Baratheon, Robert's younger brother and true heir according to the laws of succession, lurked just beyond the capital's horizon, ready to make his own claim. Cersei had Ned arrested, but the Lannisters never found his true strength in King's Landing. The men who believed in him, the silent watchers who respected his fairness. And in that flicker of hope, Ned saw the path to an unthinkable action. He had come to the capital a loyal servant to the crown. Now, with each day, he was forced to consider the possibility of rising against that very crown for the good of the realm. He would have to act before Joffrey became entrenched and any chance of saving the realm from tyranny died alongside him. It was never an easy choice. Honor wars constantly with necessity in desperate times. But as the days darkened, as more stories circulated of Joffrey's vile entertainment, ordering a butcher's boy whipped for not bowing quickly enough, or humiliating Sansa Stark in front of the court, Ned's conscience told him there was only one route left. On a quiet evening in his cramped quarters in the Red Keep, he found himself gazing out the narrow window, thinking of Winterfell. He pictured Catelyn's fiery hair shining in the cold light of the north, thought of his children racing through the Godswood, and felt a sting of guilt. He recalled his father's words. In the winter, we must protect one another, keep each other warm, share our strengths. Now, in King's Landing, he realized winter had come early, and he was all that shielded the realm from the savage cold of a tyrant's cruelty. No ravens carried word of this to distant lords. No public proclamations heralded the coming conflict. Rather, messages traveled in the hush of candlelit rooms, shared between individuals Ned trusted, rare as that trust was in King's Landing. The captain of the city watch, Janos Slint, had proven untrustworthy. Littlefinger had once promised the Goldcloaks would obey Ned's command, only to betray him at the crucial moment. But now, men of lesser station, men who had come to King's Landing from the Riverlands or the north, men with old loyalties or a certain sense of justice, began to whisper. Before, it was unthinkable. Now, it was inevitable. If the realm was to be saved from the Lannisters and their bastard king, Ned would have to strike first. One night, inside a hidden chamber near the Armorer's Forge, a place the Lannisters never bothered to check, Ned met with those who would stand with him. There was Tomard, a broad-shouldered Northman with scars across his brow who had journeyed with Ned from Winterfell. Jory Castle had been lost, but his spirit lived on in these men. There was Harwin, once a stable boy in Winterfell stables, now grown and proud, his father having served House Stark before him. And there, in a flickering patch of torchlight, stood Ser Aaron Santagar, the master-at-arms who quietly disapproved of Joffrey's reign, though he rarely spoke against the crown. They formed a small circle, the firelight highlighting the lines of worry etched into each face. Ned explained his plan in a hushed voice, words leaving his lips like confessions from a man who never wanted to stand against his king. But Joffrey was not the rightful king. Stannis was. This was no rebellion against the crown, but a reinstatement of the law of the realm. Still, the risk was colossal. If they failed, Ned and all who followed him would be labeled traitors, their heads likely mounted on spikes along the city walls. Tomard, Harwin, Ser Aaron, and the others exchanged glances. They were not hungry for war. They were hungry for justice. So they pressed their hands together, bowed heads, and pledged themselves to Ned Stark. By day, Ned continued his charade at court. He stood quietly beside Joffrey's throne, outwardly subdued, wearing the black and gray of House Stark without embellishment. Joffrey, perched on the Iron Throne, as though it were a prize he'd won in a child's game, delighted in humiliating the lords and ladies who came before him. His pale eyes flitted over them with disdain, like a cat tormenting a mouse. Queen Cersei, ever by his side, would offer a slight, satisfied smile whenever the boy king sneered a command or threatened to have someone's tongue cut out for questioning him. It made Ned's stomach churn. Sansa was forced to stand in attendance as well, trembling in silence. Joffrey would glare at her, still calling her his betrothed, even as the city rang with rumors that he was searching for a new match. Sometimes, Ned caught glimpses of Sansa's face, pale with dread, eyes rimmed red with tears she fought to hide. Whenever Ned tried to catch her eye, she would look away, too afraid of Joffrey's wrath to acknowledge her father's silent comfort. That sight alone drove Ned's resolve sharper than any steel. He would not leave his daughter a hostage to this twisted boy's caprice. The same day he finalized his decision to act, he found a moment to slip away from the prying eyes of the court and walk the corridors of the Red Keep, searching for any vantage he might use when the time came. He traversed the gallery overlooking the throne room, visualized men posted at crucial guard stations, noted the structural weaknesses. He imagined his loyal men waiting in the wings of the hall, behind columns near side entrances. The image sickened him. This was the stuff of conspirators, men who whispered in the dark. But in King's Landing, in these dire times, there was no other way. He enlisted the help of some of the Goldcloaks who despised Janos Slint and believed that a more honest city watch was needed. They remembered Ned's short tenure as Hand of the King, how he had tried to keep order without brutality. A hush overcame them as Ned confided in them that Joffrey was not the rightful king. Some of their eyes widened in alarm, fear gripping them, but others clenched their jaws. They had seen enough of Joffrey's cruelty with their own eyes. They nodded, and Ned knew that, in their hearts, these men weighed their loyalty to the crown against their duty to protect the city. If the rightful heir was Stannis, then so be it. The realm could not survive the path Joffrey was dragging it down. In secrecy, his supporters smuggled arms into the city, hid them in the cellars beneath taverns that catered to Northmen or Riverlanders, places Cersei's watchers rarely bothered to go. Quietly, the numbers grew, 10 men, then 20, 50, 100. Nobles might hesitate, But common soldiers and knights lacking great fortunes recognized the gravity of the realm's plight. Ned had carefully timed everything, waiting for the moment when the Lannisters would feel most secure, or better yet, be distracted by some of the tensions stirring in the west and the south. Meanwhile, he sought out alliances where he could. He even swallowed his reservations and spoke with Peter Baelish again, though their relationship was irreparably soured by previous treacheries. Littlefinger smiled that sly, mocking smile and assured Ned that he was only too happy to help. But Ned knew better than to trust the man's words. Instead, he sought to use Littlefinger's vanity as a distraction, to keep Baelish from interfering at the critical moment. Varys the Spider was another figure to consider. The spymaster glided through the corridors like a wraith, gathering secrets, dispensing half-truths. Ned suspected that Varys's true allegiance lay not with a king or queen, but with the realm. Perhaps Varys would quietly allow the coup if he believed it was for the good of the Seven Kingdoms. So long as Ned didn't reveal too much, Varys might turn a blind eye. The eunuch was a master at self-preservation, after all, and the prospect of a stable monarchy might appeal to him more than the spectacle of Joffrey's endless cruelty. Days turned into weeks. The tension was a coiled snake in Ned's gut, making sleep elusive. He went through his duties, forced to endure Joffrey's presence, and each day he sensed the boy's suspicion growing. Joffrey had an uncanny ability to sniff out fear, to sense that something was amiss. Cersei, as well, would arch an eyebrow whenever Ned crossed the throne room, as if wondering why he was so silent, so careful. Lancel Lannister, a cousin with features so reminiscent of Jaime, stood guard near the throne with a smirk that made Ned's knuckles itch. He knew he had to move soon. The city was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. If he delayed too long, the Lannisters might seize more power. Already, Ned sensed that the small folk were losing patience. The day before he planned to strike, a group of starving laborers from Flea Bottom came to protest outside the Red Keep's gates, complaining about the new taxes and the brutal treatment by Goldcloaks loyal to Janos Slynt. Instead of hearing them out or offering them respite, Joffrey had them beaten and chased away. From high atop the castle walls, Ned watched the men scatter. His heart clenched painfully at the injustice. Somewhere behind him, he heard a chortle that could only be Joffrey's. At dinner that evening, Joffrey presided over the table in the great hall, devouring a roast while the lords and ladies present tried to keep their faces neutral. Sansa sat to his right, stiff as a statue, her plate barely touched. Queen Cersei conversed lightly with Grand Maester Pycelle, ignoring the tension. Ned was forced to observe this farce from a seat of lesser honor along the table's side. Wine goblets shimmered under torchlight, and the smell of spiced meat filled the air. Joffrey demanded a bard sing his praises, and the man warbled a shaky tune about the lion's roar in King's Landing. The song, though clearly contrived, seemed to please Joffrey well enough. Through it all, Ned's mind raced ahead to the plan that would unfold tomorrow, to each step, each signal. If he betrayed even a hint of worry, it could mean their doom. At the feast's end, Joffrey announced that the royal court would gather in the throne room the following afternoon for an audience with emissaries from Highgarden. That news set Ned's mind ablaze. Highgarden's involvement was a complication, but it also meant that the eyes of many courtiers would be fixed on the Iron Throne. The entire Red Keep would be abuzz, which might provide cover for his men. Perhaps it was an omen of good fortune. If Margaery Tyrell or her kin came, Joffrey would be eager to show off, to posture. The Tyrells, for their part, might sense something in the air. Either way, the planned coup would not wait. Too many gears were already in motion. He left the great hall with grim determination. Tomorrow. That night, Ned penned a brief letter to his wife, but he was uncertain if it would ever reach her. In it, he explained that he loved her, that he loved all his children, and that everything he did for them. He wanted no illusions. If he survived this gambit, the realm would be changed, and perhaps House Stark would be changed with it. If he perished, he hoped he had set in motion a chain of events that would at least ensure their safety. He sealed the letter with wax, stamped it with the direwolf sigil, and entrusted it to a man in his service, commanding him to send it north at the first opportunity, if that opportunity ever came. The dawn broke hot and bright. Though a stiff breeze came off Blackwater Bay, the heat settled over the city like a warm blanket that only intensified the reek of garbage. Ned rose, dressed in his plainest tunic, pulled on a breastplate beneath a cloak that bore the Stark sigil. He paced, reciting each step of the plan in his mind. Step 1. His allies in the City Watch would gather near the outer gates of the Red Keep, discreetly replacing the usual contingent loyal to Janos Slint. Step 2. While the court was in session, Ned's loyal men, some disguised as servants, others in the livery of houses not openly known to be Stark allies, would position themselves at key points around the throne room. Step 3. Ned would confront Joffrey with the evidence of his illegitimacy, brandishing Robert's testament naming Stannis the rightful heir. Step 4. The city's watchmen loyal to Ned would surround the Lannisters before they could react. The plan was to force Joffrey's abdication quietly, if possible. But Ned doubted Joffrey or Cersei would go quietly. He prayed it would not end in a bloodbath. Yet if it did, Ned Stark was prepared to see it through. He arrived in the throne room early, under the pretense of fulfilling his duties as Hand. The high windows cast rays of morning light upon the cold stone floor. The Iron Throne loomed, a menacing silhouette of twisted swords and metal barbs. Ned glanced at it for a moment, recalling the burden it represented. He had never wanted such power, never aspired to the throne. Yet fate had placed him here, and so it was. One by one, courtiers trickled in. The usual sycophants, the lords who liked to flatter Joffrey, the ladies who vied for attention, all took their customary stations. Joffrey himself would arrive in a grander fashion, flanked by the Kingsguard. Cersei would no doubt make her entrance beside him. Ned spotted men that he recognized as his, disguised as scribes, as lesser knights, even as doormen. Many of them avoided direct eye contact, their faces carefully neutral. Varys lurked near a pillar, his plump hands folded over his stomach, expression unreadable. Littlefinger strolled in with his mocking smile, whispering to a young lady who tittered behind her fan. To the side, Ned saw one of the Goldcloaks nod almost imperceptibly in his direction, a confirmation that the guard rotation was complete. Ned exhaled slowly, a hush roaring in his ears. It was happening. In the corridor beyond, horns announced the king's arrival. Joffrey strode in, garbed in a crimson tunic embroidered with golden lions. A crown of stiff golden antlers ringed with rubies sat upon his blonde curls, incongruous as a toy. His face, however, was set in a sneer. Cersei glided beside him in a gown of deep green, her long golden hair cascading about her shoulders, her eyes scanning the hall with cat-like wariness. The Kingsguard arrayed themselves in their polished white cloaks. Ser Meryn Trant, Ser Boros Blunt, and Ser Aerys Oakhart. Ser Jaime was away, dealing with some unrest in the Riverlands, or so the rumors said. When Joffrey took his seat on the Iron Throne, the silence in the hall grew taut. Ned could sense the moment had arrived. The Tyrells had not arrived, or else they were hidden among the crowd. It hardly mattered now. Ned stepped forward, feeling the weight of every watching eye. He wore a sword at his belt. Ice was too large to carry in the throne room, but he had a simpler longsword, one that would suffice if it came to fighting. The smell of dust and old metal assaulted him as he approached the dais. Joffrey eyed him with scorn. "What is it you want, Lord Stark?" Joffrey asked, the boy's tone thick with contempt. "I've granted you leave to appear at court, but do not presume to disturb my business. We await the Tyrell envoys." Ned knelt, though his voice was steady. "Your Grace, I come with matters of great import, matters that cannot wait." Cersei's nostrils flared. She glanced at him as if she smelled a rat creeping in the shadows. "Can you not see we are busy, Stark?" she said sharply. Ned rose to his feet. He felt the hush of the hall deepen. His heart pounded. "Your Grace, my queen, I bring to your attention the last will and testament of the late King Robert Baratheon." He produced a rolled parchment from inside his cloak, sealed with Robert's broken seal. A ripple of murmurs swept the assembly. Cersei's eyes widened a fraction. She recognized the parchment. "That is a forgery," she hissed. "Guards!" But Joffrey cut her off with a raised hand, as though enjoying the drama. "Let him speak. We shall see what he has to say about my father's will." Ned's hand shook slightly as he unrolled the parchment. He read aloud, "I, Robert of the House Baratheon, the first of my name, King of the Undulls and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, do hereby name Eddard of the House Stark as Protector of the Realm to rule in my stead until my heir comes of age." The final lines rang in the still air. "In the sight of gods and men, I leave this to be my final command. Signed by King Robert, witnessed by the Grand Maester, and by myself as Hand of the King." The hall erupted in gasps. Joffrey's face contorted, a mix of rage and confusion. "Lies," he spat, but he did not look entirely certain. Cersei reached for the parchment, but Ned pulled it away. "There is more," he said, steel creeping into his voice. "King Robert was not aware that the boy Joffrey is no son of his. Your Grace, you sit upon a throne by deceit. You are no true heir. The line of succession falls to Stannis Baratheon, Robert's brother." The entire throne room seemed to convulse in shock. The gold cloaks near the doors shifted. Some had uncertain expressions. Others wore stony looks, prepared for the next step. Littlefinger's grin vanished, replaced by something like alarm. Varys gazed at Ned, unblinking. Joffrey stood so abruptly that he almost tripped on the trailing edge of his cloak. "Treason!" he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Ned. "Guards! Cut off his head!" In a swirl of movement, the Kingsguard rushed forward. Ser Meryn, Ser Boros, Ser Aerys, swords half-drawn. Ned heard the rasp of steel from behind him. Everything began to move fast, as if in a dream. Men with Stark loyalties planted throughout the hall sprang to action. One gold cloak seized Ser Boros's sword arm, twisting it behind him before the Kingsguard could fully draw his blade. Another group of men in the red and gold livery of the City Watch moved to block the dais, halberds lowered, separating Joffrey and Cersei from the rest of the court. Cersei's face blanched. She tried to push Joffrey back, to shield him with her arm. "Joffrey, behind me!" she hissed, but the boy king shoved her aside. "This is treason. Everyone sees it." Joffrey shrieked, eyes wild. "I am your king. Kill them all." Ned drew his sword. The ring of steel on stone reverberated in the vast chamber. "I name Stannis Baratheon the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms," Ned declared. "And I name Joffrey Baratheon a pretender." Men loyal to House Stark closed in. The Kingsguard fought back fiercely, but they were outnumbered. Ser Meryn managed to strike one gold cloak down. His white cloak splattered with crimson, but quickly found himself surrounded by half a dozen pointed spears. Cersei shrieked at them to stand down, but her words fell on ears that no longer recognized her authority. She spun to Joffrey, who bared his teeth in a rictus of fury. "Mother, do something," Joffrey cried, voice cracking with panic. Cersei, hair swinging, turned to search the crowd for Lannister guards. But the men who might have come to her aid were being ushered out or subdued by the watchmen who had replaced Janos Slynt's loyalists. In mere moments, the coup sealed the throne room as though an invisible lid clamped over a boiling pot. Lannister men found themselves cornered, forced to drop their weapons or face immediate death. Peter Baelish watched with wide eyes. Varys maintained an inscrutable expression, giving no sign of support or opposition. The courtiers fled behind pillars or rushed for the doors, only to find them blocked by watchmen. Sansa clutched the edges of her seat, trembling, uncertain whether to run or cry out. Ned advanced up the steps to the Iron Throne. His sword was lowered, a sign that he did not intend needless slaughter. Yet he knew all too well how violent these next moments could become. He could hear hearts pounding, sense the fear radiating from the courtiers pressed against the walls. "King Joffrey," he said, voice echoing in the hush that followed the chaos. "You are accused of usurping the throne, of harassing the realm, and of possessing no legal right to rule. In the name of the rightful King Stannis, I demand you step down." Joffrey gnashed his teeth, clutching the arms of the Iron Throne so tightly that the edges bit into his pale hands. "I will not," he hissed. "You traitors will die for this." Cersei clung to his shoulder, her eyes darting around for any chance of escape. "You have no proof," she snarled. "Everything you say is a lie. Jaime is on his way, and you will suffer for." Ned cut across her words with surprising calm. "We have the proof, and I have sworn statements from certain maesters who have examined the line of succession, from Pycelle himself, from the remnants of King Robert's own testimony. He wrote it before his death. The crown belongs to Stannis." "Lies! All lies!" Joffrey's shrill voice grated. Spittle flecked his lips. He tried to stand, but Ned's men leveled pikes. The Boy King's eyes darted in panic. A hush rippled outward. The gold cloaks who had surrounded the dais parted, revealing Tomard, one of Ned's staunch Northmen, standing behind them. "Lord Stark," Tomard said. "The men are in place." That was the final piece. The Red Keep itself was under their control or near enough. Cersei's face twisted in horror. "This is madness," she said, breathing rapidly, her composure shattered. Her hand shot to the neckline of her gown, perhaps searching for a hidden dagger, but she found nothing. "You claim to serve the realm, but all you bring is chaos. The Lannisters will not stand for this." Ned thought of how many times the realm had not stood for the Lannisters' machinations. Yet the Lannisters always seemed to win, no matter the means. No more. Taking a breath, he raised his voice to the entire hall. "I, Eddard Stark, hand of the late King Robert, have seized control of this court in the name of the rightful monarch Stannis Baratheon. All those who are loyal to King Stannis and to the law of the Seven Kingdoms, lay down your arms and you will not be harmed. Those who raise steel in defense of Joffrey, the Pretender, will face treason charges." A ripple of confusion seized the hall. Then men and women began to slowly, anxiously kneel. Even some of those sworn to the Lannisters found themselves with no choice. They dropped their weapons and knelt, heads bowed. The Kingsguard, glaring fiercely, saw they were hopelessly outnumbered. Their blades clattered to the floor. Only Joffrey and Cersei remained standing, their pride forbidding them to kneel. "You can't do this," Joffrey said, his voice high and thin, full of impotent rage. "I'm the king. Stand down," Ned said, lowering his sword. A swirl of emotion tore through him. This was a child, albeit a cruel, monstrous child. He thought of Sansa watching. He had no desire to see Joffrey run through with a sword, not unless it was absolutely necessary. But if the boy refused to back down, war might be the only outcome. At that moment, a scuffle broke out near the throne room entrance. Men parted, revealing Sansa, who had finally mustered the courage to leave her seat, rush through the lines of guards, and throw herself at Ned's feet. "Father!" she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Don't hurt him, please. He's my—" She stopped, remembering in a flash that Joffrey was no rightful betrothed. Confusion and heartbreak flashed in her eyes. "I don't want anyone to die." Ned rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "No one needs to die," he said, voice quiet. "But Joffrey must relinquish the throne. The realm must have true justice." Some of the watchers muttered among themselves, uncertain. Ned could see the cracks in Joffrey's bravado. The boy's lips quivered, his face reddening. He had never truly faced a moment where all his power might be stripped away. He looked pathetically young, almost childlike, and yet the cruelty in his gaze remained. "I'll have your head for this," he whispered, eyes locked on Ned. Then something unexpected happened. Cersei sank to her knees, her face going ashen. She clasped Joffrey's arm and pulled him down forcibly. "Kneel," she hissed into his ear, though others could hear it echo in the hush. She knew that to resist now would mean certain death. "Kneel, Joffrey. We must live to fight another day." Joffrey's eyes filled with tears of rage, but his mother's grip was iron. Slowly, the boy king sank to his knees. His once proud crown toppled from his head, rolling across the stone floor until it clanged against a step. A hush fell over the hall, so profound that it felt as though the entire city held its breath. Ned stared, partly relieved, partly stunned. In the corner of his vision, he saw Sansa turn away, unable to watch. "I, Joffrey of House Baratheon," the boy began, his voice choking on the words. It seemed each syllable cost him a shard of his pride. "Hereby abdicate the throne in favor of Lord Stannis Baratheon. May the gods punish all traitors." Then he bowed his head, and the tension in the throne room finally burst like a yoke. A dozen men exhaled in unison, relief coloring their faces. Others stared in disbelief at the spectacle of the golden-haired boy kneeling before Eddard Stark's men. Sansa sobbed quietly, uncertain of what she felt. Cersei looked as if she wished to tear the world apart with her bare hands. Ned signaled his men, who rushed forward to bind Joffrey and Cersei's wrists, but gently, carefully. He did not want a new wave of violence. He insisted they be treated well. After all, they were no common criminals, and the realm would question brutality. "We will hold them until King Stannis arrives," Ned announced to the hall. "They will be treated with dignity, but they must not be allowed to flee. Any harm done to them will be met with punishment. We are not murderers." That pronouncement set off a flutter of relief, or at least less fear, among those who had been loyal to the Lannisters. Ned turned to Sansa, who looked up at him, eyes awash in tears. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, trembling. I want my sister. Have you found Arya?" Ned closed his eyes momentarily. Arya had slipped out of the Red Keep days before, possibly disguised, after a run-in with the Lannisters. "Not yet," he said softly. "But I will. She's out there. Somewhere safe, I pray." Tears slipped down Sansa's cheeks again, but she stood strong. The wave of the coup was passing, and now Ned could see the aftermath forming around him. Goldcloaks stood uncertainly, some loyal to the new order, some staring at the bound royals in shock. The lords and ladies along the walls murmured about the precarious future. House Tyrell's envoys, if they were anywhere close, would soon learn of this day's events. The realm would soon be in flux, rumors spreading like wildfire. Only a handful of watchers remained silent and composed. Varys regarded Ned with a grave nod, then slipped away into the corridor. Littlefinger still wore a thin, calculating smile, as though already spinning how he might profit from this shift in power. Ned resolved to keep a close eye on him. The captured Kingsguard glowered. Queen Cersei and Joffrey were led away by Ned's men to rooms within Maegor's Holdfast, locked but decently appointed, until Stannis arrived to either confirm their imprisonment or announce further judgment. The battered watchers parted as Ned walked across the floor, Sansa at his side. The Iron Throne stood tall in front of them, that monstrous seat forged of conquered swords. Ned had no desire to sit upon it. He thought of Robert, who had disliked the burden of kingship. He thought of the innocents who had died in wars for that monstrous seat. By capturing Joffrey, he had done something he never wanted. He had forcibly decided the fate of the crown. But he felt the weight of it, even as he turned away, motioning for his men to secure the Red Keep thoroughly. Once outside the throne room, Ned breathed the open air in the courtyard, the sky overhead almost painfully bright after the torchlit gloom of the hall. He looked around, glimpsing men busily consolidating control over the castle's entrances. Shouts rose here and there, but the heavy fighting had been largely avoided. Indeed, the city seemed calmer than expected. No great riots, only pockets of confusion. He said a silent prayer to the old gods that they had been spared a massacre. Still, he knew the real test was yet to come. Tywin Lannister commanded forces that might not accept Joffrey's abdication so easily. There would be factions that chafed under any rule not involving Lannister gold. A swirl of skirts drew his attention. Sansa was standing behind him, slender and fragile, eyes rimmed red. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What happens now?" He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We hold the city in the name of King Stannis until he arrives to claim his throne. We keep order. We protect the realm as best we can." Sansa seemed to wilt at the mention of Stannis, whose reputation was far from kindly, but she nodded, swallowing hard. "And Joffrey?" Ned hesitated. He knew what Stannis might do if the truth of Joffrey's parentage became widely accepted. The boy's life might be forfeit to quell any future claims. But that decision was not Ned's to make. He would not stoop to the Lannisters' level by beheading a child in cold blood. He will stand trial, or King Stannis will decide his fate, Ned said quietly. Sansa nodded again, though her expression was stricken. Her illusions about Joffrey had been brutally torn away, but her memories of the boy she had once admired still lingered, haunting her. Ned embraced her gently. They stood like that for a moment, father and daughter, while the bustle of men arming themselves and reorganizing the guard spun around them like leaves in a storm. The day stretched on. Ned worked tirelessly, ordering the Goldcloaks to remain calm, to keep the peace. Janos Slynt, after realizing the shift in power, tried to come slinking back, proclaiming loyalty to Ned. But Ned had not forgotten how Slynt had betrayed him before, leading to the slaughter of his men. Ned commanded that he be placed under guard as well, until a formal hearing could take place. In the courtyard, news of Joffrey's abdication spread among the common folk. They gaped, uncertain whether to believe such astonishing tidings. Some rejoiced quietly, remembering how they had been brutalized under Joffrey's capricious orders. Others feared the next king might be worse. By dusk, the Red Keep was firmly in Ned's control. The only danger lay in how quickly the Lannisters' forces would react outside the city. Ned prayed that with Joffrey and Cersei captured, Tywin might hesitate to begin a war that would surely endanger his daughter and grandchildren. If Tywin was wise, he would parley with Stannis, perhaps bargain for more lenient terms. Ned could not see Tywin Lannister bowing easily, but he might at least refrain from burning King's Landing. Despite everything, Ned still clung to the hope that another horror like the sack of King's Landing under Robert's rebellion would not be repeated. Night fell, and with it came a semblance of uneasy order. Ned settled in the solar that once belonged to the hand of the king, his office, ironically. He removed his breastplate and sank into a chair. The day's events weighed on him until his shoulders felt leaden. Sansa had gone to her chambers. He had posted trustworthy men outside her door. For the first time in weeks, Ned felt as though he could breathe. The war, if it came, would come later. For the moment, the capital was relieved of Joffrey's malignant presence on the throne. A knock came at the door, and Harwin entered. "Lord, we've had reports of small fights in the city. Some men loyal to the Lannisters causing trouble, but we're stamping it out. We've locked them up in the dungeons. No sign of major resistance yet." Ned nodded. "Good. And have the envoys from Highgarden arrived?" Harwin gave a tight smile. "They arrived after the news broke. They were, shall we say, surprised. But they agreed to stay at an inn under guard while the city is secured. They might want an audience with you, or prefer to wait until Stannis arrives." "Hard to say." Ned rubbed his temples. "Let them wait. Our priority is stabilizing the city." "Yes, Lord." Harwin left, and the door clicked shut behind him. Ned's mind wandered to the north. Had his sons heard the news yet? Robb, forced to shoulder manhood too early, might be rallying the lords of the north in response to the Lannisters' threats. Bran, too young to understand the complexities, but wise in his own way, might be hearing rumors about the shape of the realm. And Rickon, just a babe, might wonder where his father had gone. He hoped that his actions here would spare them from a greater conflict, at least in part. He felt a pang of guilt for the burdens he had left Robb. He dozed fitfully, waking when dawn's light crept through the shutters. Another day, another swirl of demands. He met with the Goldcloaks' new officers, who pledged their loyalty to the rightful king, Stannis. He wrote letters to Stannis, to the maesters at Dragonstone, explaining the situation and urging the would-be king to come quickly, if he truly wished to claim the throne. He tried to organize bread for the small folk, to stem any riots from hunger. The city was calmer than expected, though pockets of tension remained. The longer the power vacuum existed, the more likely some new threat would arise. On the third day after Joffrey's abdication, a raven came from the east. Stannis Baratheon, having received Ned's urgent summons, announced that he was already sailing for King's Landing with a fleet. His letter was curt, formal. Stannis had little warmth in his bones. He demanded that Joffrey and Cersei be held secure. He demanded that the City Watch swear loyalty to him. He demanded that the traitors who had lied about his illegitimacy, i.e., any who had supported Joffrey's right to rule, come forth for justice. The hallmark dryness of Stannis' style was evident in every word. Ned sighed and read the letter over and over. Stannis would likely bring a stern and unyielding approach to the capital. This might quell any rebellions, but it would hardly endear him to the small folk. Still, if it preserved peace, Ned was willing to see it done. The greatest question, looming like a sword above them, was how to handle the Lannisters. Tywin was not a man known for forgiveness, nor for surrender. Yet Tywin's grandson was a prisoner in King's Landing. Ned spent hours each day speaking with Sansa, trying to help her understand that she was safe now, that Joffrey would not harm her anymore. She tried to be brave, but Ned could see how fragile her heart was. She had witnessed the downfall of her illusions, and the boy she once idolized now sat imprisoned, raging and cursing in the confines of his gilded cage. The King's Guard, or those who remained, had been put under guard as well. Ser Barristan Selmy had not been in the capital for the events. He had been away on some errand, and Ned found himself wondering how the legendary knight would react to this coup. Perhaps, if the gods were kind, Selmy would support the rightful king. In the days that followed, Ned personally visited Joffrey and Cersei in their quarters within Maegor's Holdfast. They were not cramped dungeons, but certainly not lavish apartments either. The windows were barred, and guards stood watch. The first time Ned entered, Cersei rose from her chair, eyes flashing with hatred. Joffrey sat in a corner, arms crossed, refusing to acknowledge Ned's presence. The boy's eyes were puffy, as if he had been crying in secret. "Lord Stark," Cersei drawled icily. "Come to gloat." Ned kept his tone even. "I come to ensure you are well treated, and to let you know that Stannis Baratheon will arrive soon." Joffrey's gaze snapped up. "He'll never be my king," he spat, his voice cracking. "I'll kill him. I'll kill you all." "Be silent, Joff," Cersei said, a brittle note in her voice. She turned back to Ned. "You think Stannis will be merciful? You don't know him." "I know that justice must be done," Ned replied. He offered no illusions. "If the boy surrenders and confesses, perhaps King Stannis will show clemency." "Confesses to what?" Joffrey snarled, bounding to his feet. "I've done nothing wrong. The realm is mine by right. Your piece of paper means nothing." Cersei placed a hand on Joffrey's shoulder, as though trying to calm him. Ned sensed a flicker of protective maternal instinct in her eyes. Despite all her cunning, she seemed genuinely frightened for her son's life. "Leave us," she commanded Ned. "You've done enough." Ned turned to the door, pausing to glance over his shoulder. "I do not relish this," he said quietly, "but I will see it through." Then he left. As the days continued, Ned slowly transformed from conspirator to caretaker of the realm. He oversaw the reorganization of the City Watch, ensuring men of questionable loyalty were replaced. He had the main gates monitored, and food distributions set up to prevent unrest. Letters poured in from across the Seven Kingdoms, some praising the end of Joffrey's reign, some condemning Ned Stark as a usurper who had betrayed the rightful Lannister king. Only time and the presence of Stannis would give the realm the final word. Still, Ned took no pleasure in these tasks. He was a soldier of honor, a warden of the North, not a king. That he was forced to act like one now, if only temporarily, weighed upon him like a boulder tied around his neck. Finally, after weeks of anxious waiting, word came that Stannis Baratheon's fleet had arrived at the mouth of Blackwater Bay. A hush fell over King's Landing. No one knew if Stannis would march in as a liberator or a conqueror. Ned arranged to meet him at the harbor, along with a delegation of lords and knights, to present the city's surrender in the name of the rightful king. The morning of Stannis' arrival was gray and overcast. Ned rode through the streets with a small escort, mostly his loyal men, plus a few uneasy goldcloaks. Crowds thronged, whispering, some shouting curses against the Lannisters, others cowering in fear. The monarchy had changed hands more often than they could track in recent memory, and they expected nothing good to come of it. By the time Ned reached the docks, the fleet was already visible. Row upon row of war galleys with the flaming heart of House Baratheon on their sails. Soldiers disembarked, forming disciplined lines along the quay. At their head stood a tall, gaunt man in dark armor, Stannis himself. He was flanked by Ser Davos Seaworth and several lords sworn to House Baratheon. Stannis's face was set in a perpetual scowl, mouth pinched as though tasting something bitter. The men parted to allow Ned to approach. Ned dismounted and bowed stiffly. He presented Robert's testament, along with the news that Joffrey had abdicated and the city was being held for the rightful king's arrival. Stannis's pale eyes flickered over the letter. He read it, jaw tightening at the mention of Joffrey's abdication, an event that had outpaced him. Then he rolled the parchment. "You did this?" he asked, voice clipped. "I led the coup, yes," Ned said. "I believed it was what Robert would have wanted, and what the law demands." Stannis regarded him with an unreadable expression. "You broke the law by resorting to arms against a crowned king. Yet you did so to enforce the true law of succession." He exhaled sharply. "Very well. You did what you must. The realm will judge if it was just." Ned dipped his head. "I welcome your judgment, your grace." It was strange calling Stannis your grace, but that was what the realm's laws decreed. The new king surveyed the city looming behind Ned, the spires of the Red Keep. "I trust that the Lannisters who remain in the city are under guard?" "Yes, my king." Stannis nodded curtly. "My men will occupy the Red Keep. We will secure the walls. Then I will pronounce judgment on Joffrey and his mother." Thus began a new chapter in the city's uneasy saga. Stannis's men flooded King's Landing, which quickly became as tense as a city under siege. But no open battles raged, for Ned Stark's men maintained a fragile cooperation with the Baratheon forces. Ned led Stannis and his retinue to the Red Keep, where Stannis claimed the throne with no pomp or ceremony, ignoring the usual coronation flourishes. He simply ascended the dais, stared at the Iron Throne, and took a seat. It was a stark, joyless moment, but final. The realm had a new king. In the days that followed, trials and hearings were held. The city's small folk gathered around the open courtyard where announcements were made. One morning, after a swift gathering of Stannis's council, Ned stood by, arms folded, as King Stannis pronounced sentencing upon Joffrey. The boy had been brought forth, manacles on his wrists, escorted by 2 dour-faced Baratheon men-at-arms. Cersei stood to one side, under guard, pale and gaunt from her captivity. A hush fell over the crowd. Many had come to gawk at the monstrous Child King who had terrorized them. Some hurled insults under their breath. Others simply stared in grim fascination. Joffrey, looking smaller and thinner than ever, nonetheless wore a look of defiance. His eyes flickered to the dais where Stannis stood. Ned could see the hatred burning in the boy's gaze. Stannis spoke, his voice harsh as the scratch of iron on stone. "Joffrey Hill, known as Joffrey Baratheon, you stand accused of high treason, the murder of innocents, the unlawful execution of Eddard Stark's men, and the usurpation of the Iron Throne. You have abdicated, and you have confessed to no wrongdoing. Have you anything to say?" Joffrey lifted his chin. "You're not my king. The throne is mine by right. I wish you all the headsman's axe." A wave of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Stannis's face remained stony. "Your mother has begged clemency for you, offering you a life of exile on the condition that you never again claim the throne. This is a matter of the realm's peace. But your crimes are beyond doubt." Ned expected a swift condemnation. He had spoken to Stannis in private, urging the king to show mercy, for war would only worsen if the Lannisters felt their bloodline was brutally oppressed. Yet he knew Stannis to be a hard man, rarely swayed by sentimental arguments. The very fate of the realm might hinge on this moment. If Joffrey was executed, Tywin Lannister would be given a motive to wage unrelenting war. But if Joffrey lived, he might forever remain a rallying point for Lannister loyalists. Stannis's voice rang out. It is the sentence of this court that you be confined to the wall, to live out your days in the night's watch, where you will take no wife, hold no lands, and father no children. Should you refuse this sentence, you will forfeit your life." A collective gasp broke across the courtyard. Ned felt a surge of relief tempered by worry. The night's watch was an unexpected compromise, one that both exiled Joffrey and spared his life. But the boy's reaction was immediate. "No!" he screamed, yanking in vain at his chains. "I'm a king. I won't be sent away to freeze and die with criminals." Stannis's gaze remained implacable. "You will be taken forthwith to the wall, where you will say the vows. That is the crown's mercy." Joffrey spat in the dirt. He looked around, desperate for allies, but there were none. Cersei crumpled to her knees, tears streaking her face. She tried to fling herself at Stannis's feet, but guards held her back. "He's just a boy," she wailed. "Send me in his place if you must, but don't send my son to that frozen tomb." Stannis regarded her coldly. "Your boy is no innocent. The watch shall be a better end than what many demanded." With that, he motioned for the guards to remove Joffrey. The crowd parted as the boy was dragged away, cursing and screaming. Some small folk jeered, some stared in mute astonishment. Ned caught sight of Sansa at the edge of the crowd, tears shining in her eyes. She did not cheer, nor did she look relieved. She was too overwhelmed, her heart too entangled in conflicting emotions. In the following days, Stannis dealt with Cersei's fate and those of her brothers in absentia. Tywin Lannister's reaction was still unknown. Would he march on King's Landing, or negotiate for peace? Stannis, never one for half measures, made it clear that if Tywin threatened the crown, the full might of Baratheon, with support from the north if Ned consented, would meet him in battle. Yet Ned sensed that a more diplomatic solution might still be possible, given that Joffrey's life had been spared. For Ned Stark, the coup had succeeded beyond his darkest expectations. He had saved the city from immediate tyranny, forced a false king to abdicate without an all-out slaughter, and placed the recognized heir on the throne. And yet, the realm was far from settled. War still lurked, political tensions crackled, and the Lannisters remained a threat. But as he walked the walls of the Red Keep one final time, the wind off the Blackwater Bay stirring his cloak, he thought of his father's words again. When the cold winds blow, it falls to the strong to protect the weak. He had done that, or tried. Looking out over King's Landing, the city's rooftops sprawling like a patchwork quilt, Ned saw a tentative peace. In the distance, gulls wheeled over the harbor, the same harbor where the Baratheon fleet had arrived. And he realized something. Even if the realm was not yet at peace, even if war threatened, at least one monstrous injustice had been undone. A false king had been toppled, dethroned not for a power grab, but for the sake of the laws of succession. No matter what else happened, the people could cling to that small truth. His steps carried him to the courtyard, where a handful of men awaited his orders. Ser Aaron Santagar offered a respectful bow. Ser Davos Seaworth, new to the capital, dipped his head in greeting, though he had come as Stannis's loyal knight. The two men spoke in quiet voices about forging a stable government, about bracing for the possibility of Tywin Lannister's reprisal. Ned listened calmly, aware that the burdens of a new conflict might soon weigh heavily upon them all. But at least they were addressing it openly, not cowering before a sadistic boy king. In a corner by the stables, Ned saw Sansa conversing with a pair of her old handmaidens. She appeared distracted, but less fearful than before. Maybe in time, she would recover from her ordeal, her illusions tempered by the harsh reality she had witnessed. He prayed Arya was safe somewhere, and that in time she too could return, though he suspected Arya would have much to say about the madness that had gripped the city. That evening, Ned received a raven from Winterfell, carrying words of support from Robb. The North stood behind him, Robb wrote, if war came. The letter closed with news that Catelyn had gone to negotiate with the Riverlords, ensuring that the Starks might have allies should the Lannisters press an attack. Ned felt torn. This was not the future he wanted for Robb, for the realm, but it was better than leaving a vicious boy on the throne to torment the Seven Kingdoms. At least if war came, the realm would not be fighting for a lie. Once again, he found himself in the God's Wood near the Red Keep's walls, a meager patch of trees and a small reflection pool. It lacked the ancient heart trees of the north, but he found some solace in the greenery. There he knelt, bowing his head to whatever gods would hear him in this southern place. He prayed for wisdom, for strength to guide the realm. He prayed for mercy upon the boy who had been cast down, for though Joffrey was cruel, he was still a child shaped by dark influences. He prayed for Cersei's soul, for the seeds of hate in her heart to one day wither. Most of all, he prayed for the realm to endure, to find some measure of stability and peace. When he rose, the sky had faded to twilight, a haze of orange and purple over the city's rooftops. He left the God's Wood and returned to the labyrinthine corridors of the Red Keep. Along the way, he passed men in new livery, the stag of House Baratheon against a field of black. Their presence reminded him of how swiftly the tides of power shift in King's Landing. One day the Lannisters, the next day House Baratheon's rightful heir. And yet the city remained, a testament to the thousands of lives that called it home, all at the mercy of high lords and kings. In a quiet corridor, he passed a cluster of watchers whispering about the possibility that Joffrey might refuse the Night's Watch vow, forcing Stannis to execute him. Ned recognized that scenario. At the crowning moment, the Watch would give Joffrey one last chance. Take the black or forfeit his life. What the boy chose would be his own doing. If he chose death, that was on him. If he chose the Watch, he would vanish from the realm's politics forever, or so one could hope. Eventually, Ned found himself in the old Solar again, listening as the Red Keep's bustle died down for the night. 1,000 problems awaited him tomorrow, convincing certain lords to uphold Stannis's claim, navigating the new alliances forming in the aftermath, pacifying the capital's population, and preparing for a potential war with the Lannisters. Yet, in the hush of the moment, he allowed himself a small moment of reflection. The coup he had never wanted to lead was done. He had forced Joffrey from the throne, not for personal gain, but to save the realm from a king who had no legitimacy. He thought of Robert's face, beaming in the old days, bellowing laughter in the halls of Winterfell. He thought of that same face, pale and drawn on his deathbed, commanding Ned to take the reins until the rightful heir stood ready. Robert's final pleas had echoed in Ned's mind ever since. Now he had honored that trust. The realm, battered and weary, might at least have a chance at honest leadership under Stannis, though Stannis's harshness would bring challenges of its own. Still, Ned believed the laws of the Seven Kingdoms would stand, and in that belief, he found a measure of resolve to face whatever tomorrow would bring. He closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. In a corner of the room, a single candle flickered, its light dancing on the walls. He listened to the distant sound of the wind rustling through the Red Keep's open windows, and in that soft hush, he almost imagined he heard the voice of his father speaking from the north, praising him for standing firm. But it was only the wind. With a final glance at the letter from Robb, Ned stood. Tomorrow he would continue this work. He would see the city stabilized under Stannis's rule, try to temper the new king's rigid sense of justice with what compassion he could muster. He would see to it that his daughter was cared for, that the city's small folk did not starve, that the realm was not ripped apart further. All because Eddard Stark had dared to stage a coup in King's Landing, because there was no other way to stop a cruel boy from leading the realm to ruin. He had broken his own code in a way, stepping beyond the passive acceptance of a false king's rule and taking arms against the monarchy. Yet the monarchy had become a twisted mockery of itself, built on lies. If anyone asked him if he regretted it, he would think of Sansa's bruises, of Micah the butcher's boy, of all those who had suffered under Joffrey's tyranny. And he would say no. In a quiet final moment, he opened the window shutters, looked out at the labyrinth of King's Landing, the black waters of the bay beyond. Tomorrow loomed like a question, but for now the city was free of Joffrey's dominion. A hush lay over it, as though the entire capital were in mourning or in relief, perhaps both. Ned whispered a silent prayer that come winter or war, he would guide the realm through the trials. That was all he could do, fulfill his duty and protect the realm. And so, with his heart heavier and yet more hopeful than it had been in weeks, Eddard Stark let the candle burn low and prepared himself for the new dawn. Ned Stark rose before dawn the next day, an old ache in his bones, born of too many nights of war councils and anxious worry, weighing him down as he dressed in subdued gray. He felt once again like a stranger in this southern stronghold. Despite all that had transpired, the Red Keep still radiated its typical oppressive warmth, its corridors cramped with tension and lit by the flicker of torches at each junction. Now, though, that tension had a different flavor. Stannis Baratheon, the newly acknowledged king of the Seven Kingdoms, had brought order in place of Joffrey's manic cruelty. Yet the quiet that came with Stannis was no balm. It was grim, heavy with the knowledge that Tywin Lannister might soon come roaring down on the capital with fire and steel, or that the Iron Throne could spark fresh rebellions in corners of the realm that had never truly accepted Baratheon rule. He stepped out into the courtyard, adjusting the sword belt around his hips, the old reflexes of a soldier as ingrained as breathing. His personal guard, Northmen he trusted, shadowed him across the worn cobblestones. The sky in the east began to turn pale gold, and the faint smell of the sea wafted across the high walls of the keep. King's Landing was stirring. Beyond the gates, already he heard the chatter of small folk, the creak of cartwheels, the bark of vendors opening their stalls. Life went on, even after a king's crown was toppled. At the heart of the courtyard, a weathered statue of Aegon the Conqueror stood watch. By that statue waited Ser Davos Seaworth, the man known as the Onion Knight. Davos wore plain clothing despite his status as one of King Stannis's most trusted counselors, a living testament to Stannis's preference for merit over birth. The knight dipped his head in greeting. "Lord Stark," he said, voice quiet. "His Grace expects you in the council chamber." Ned nodded. "How does the king fare this morning?" Davos gave a mild shrug. "He's as he ever is, stern, impatient, concerned about Tywin Lannister's next move." Ned sighed. "As am I." They climbed the steps into the Red Keep's inner halls. On the way, they passed men in Baratheon livery posted at each doorway, heavy cloaks draped over shoulders, halberds in hand. The men gave Ned respectful nods. Not long ago, he recalled passing gold cloaks loyal to Joffrey and feeling only dread. Everything could change in King's Landing in the span of a heartbeat. The city swirled with rumors. Some insisted Joffrey had been executed. Others said he had gone mad and flung himself from the walls. The truth was that he had been sentenced to the Night's Watch, to take the black in place of death. And while Ned quietly approved of the leniency, he knew such a punishment would resonate throughout the realm. A dethroned boy king in black was a living symbol of the old regime's failure, and Tywin Lannister was not known to tolerate insults to his bloodline. When they entered the council chamber, Ned found King Stannis already seated at the massive wooden table. Several others stood in attendance. Grand Maester Pycelle, looking somehow even older as he hovered with an uneasy stoop. Lord Mathos, the son of Davos, a bright-eyed young man rarely far from his father's side, and a handful of lords sworn to Storm's End. Also present was Peter Baelish, leaning against a pillar with his arms crossed, and Varys, half hidden in the corner, plump hands folded over his voluminous robes. It seemed Littlefinger had managed, as ever, to remain too useful, or at least too elusive, to cast out. Varys, no doubt, was at Stannis's behest, quietly observing. Stannis's penetrating gaze met Ned's. The king was not wearing a crown. He had never been one for ostentation. His hairline was receding, and the shadow of stubble on his jaw did little to soften the rigid line of his mouth. A surcoat bearing the flaming heart of the Lord of Dragonstone covered his lean frame. He drummed his fingertips on the table, an impatient habit that set the old wood vibrating. "Lord Stark," he said by way of greeting. His voice, as usual, was rough as a grind's. "Tom, you've seen the letter from Riverrun?" Ned nodded. He had read it at dawn. "Yes, your grace." "Then you know what it means," Stannis went on. "Tywin Lannister is assembling a host at Harrenhal. The River Lords are anxious. They fear a strike west from that cursed fortress." Ned remembered Harrenhal's looming towers, its blackened walls. a fortress that dwarfed all others in scale, still haunted by the memory of Dragonflame. "The Lannisters will not take kindly to Joffrey's deposition," Ned said. "But will Lord Tywin truly march on King's Landing while his daughter and grandson remain here, effectively hostage?" Davos glanced at the king. Tywin is not a man to leave his kin to captivity, especially not someone as precious to him as Cersei Lannister. He'll want them back. The question is whether he'll try negotiation or assault. Stannis's lips curled slightly. "We shall see. I sent a raven suggesting parley, but Tywin's reply was non-committal. He wants Cersei and Joffrey released at once, unharmed, or he threatens devastation. The man is brazen." The king exhaled. "He would not be so bold if we had the Targaryen dragons of old." Ned let a tense silence pass. He recalled the fury that Tywin Lannister had unleashed upon the city decades ago during Robert's rebellion, how his troops had sacked King's Landing in the name of the new king. More blood in these streets could tear the realm apart. If negotiations failed, the city might face a siege worse than anything Joffrey had inflicted. Littlefinger's mocking voice broke into the hush. "We could consider strategic leniencies." His gaze flicked to Ned, then Stannis. "The boy is no longer a threat, is he? The mother is a spent force as well. One might return them to Tywin in exchange for a sworn oath of peace. It would be cheaper than bloodshed. War is so very costly, especially with the crown's finances in the state they're in." Ned stiffened. The thought of handing Joffrey and Cersei back to Tywin, to allow them free rein, turned his stomach. He remembered too well the outrages they had committed while in power. They would simply bide their time until they found a means to overthrow Stannis. "We can't possibly trust them." Stannis did not blink. "Lord Baelish would have us release them? You'd best hold your tongue, Littlefinger, lest I think you put coin above the rule of law. Cersei has conspired, murdered, and lied to seat her bastard son on the throne. The boy spilled innocent blood in these streets. I have no intention of releasing them." Littlefinger, unabashed, tilted his head and offered a shrug. "I merely counsel pragmatism, Your Grace." Stannis said nothing to that, only glared. Then he turned to Ned. "You have wise counsel, Stark. In the interim, we keep the Lannisters under lock and key. When the time for a peace treaty arrives, if it arrives, they can be bargaining pieces. Tywin will not risk Joffrey's head on a spike. He values him too much, bastard though he may be." Ned inclined his head. He was no politician, but he understood the power of hostages well enough. And yet, part of him still abhorred using Sansa's mother-in-law-to-be. No, that was no longer betrothed at all, he reminded himself. Joffrey's betrothal to Sansa had ended the moment he was deposed. The entire affair left a bitter taste in Ned's mouth. But if keeping the realm from a full-scale war meant holding the Lannisters, he would do it. A hush settled, punctuated only by the soft rasp of Grand Maester Pycelle's labored breathing. Then Stannis said, "Now we must speak of alliances. The Tyrells linger at the city's outskirts. They seemed ready to support Joffrey once, but the boy's downfall may lead them to us, if we can offer enough. And I've had word that Renly—" He paused, mouth twisting. "My brother is mustering men as well. Renly fancies himself a rival claimant, as if birth order means nothing." Ned cast his eyes downward. Robert was gone, and the two younger brothers pulled the realm in different directions. "Renly has always been charismatic," he said carefully. "He is well liked by the lords of the Reach. If the Tyrells throw their strength behind him, we could face a second front." Stannis clasped his hands on the table. "Precisely. I will not suffer my own brother's rebellion. The law of succession is clear. My claim trumps his. But if he truly wishes to put the realm at ease, we might find terms. If not—" He left the sentence hanging, but the threat was obvious. Stannis would do what was needed. Davos, standing beside Ned, spoke softly. "We can dispatch emissaries to Renly. Better to talk first, steal second." Stannis gestured agreement. "You shall do it, Davos. Take a ship upriver. Renly's last known position was at Bitterbridge. If you find him, deliver my terms. Tell him there is one Baratheon king by right of law. If he sets aside his ambitions and pledges fealty, he will be pardoned and rewarded. But if he refuses, I will treat him as I would any usurper." He narrowed his eyes. Robert was too forgiving. "I am not." Ned felt a chill. It seemed the realm stood upon a sword's edge. One misstep could plunge all 7 kingdoms into a war more devastating than Robert's rebellion. He remembered the battered remains of the Targaryen children, butchered by Gregor Clegane, all for a throne. Must the realm always bleed for monarchy? He forced the thoughts away, turning his focus to the immediate tasks. "I will continue to keep order in King's Landing, Your Grace. The small folk are anxious, and I'd see that the city watch remains firmly in hand. Our supplies will need to be managed carefully if Tywin does attempt a siege." Stannis allowed a curt nod. "Do it. We'll weather what comes. I'll see the city does not go hungry on my watch. It was ill-led under Robert, drowned in debt. If I must melt the gold of the houses in the Crownlands to pay for bread, I will. But no more illusions. If Lannister aggression is unstoppable, I will meet it with the full might of Storm's End, and I will expect the North to march as well." Ned's jaw tightened. "If the Lannisters attack, the North will rise. My son Robb already gathers our bannermen to secure the neck, in case war spills over. The North keeps its oaths, so long as your grace honors your own." Stannis regarded Ned with his usual sour look, but beneath it Ned glimpsed something like respect. "A man's word must mean something, Stark," the king said. "Now let us see to the smaller matters. Grand Maester, read the list of petitions." And so the council session wore on, with Pycelle droning about ports in the Stormlands, overdue taxes from lords in the Crownlands, the uncertain situation in the Vale, and so forth. The chatter blurred in Ned's mind, though he listened as best he could. Occasionally, Littlefinger interjected with some wry remark about coin or resources, and Stannis responded by ignoring him or growling an impatient refusal. Varys said little, but Ned sensed the spymaster's eyes flicking to him now and then, as though measuring how well the new hand adapted to his role. When at last the council adjourned, the sun stood high in the sky. Ned followed Davos out into the corridor, intending to walk together a while, but Stannis's voice called after him. "Lord Stark, a word." Ned turned. Davos bowed and withdrew, leaving the 2 men alone in the corridor except for a single Baratheon guard at a discreet distance. Stannis's expression was inscrutable, the planes of his face hard and unforgiving. "You and I have our differences," Stannis said. "I've not forgotten that you once served Robert, and that you confronted Cersei with your findings about Joffrey's parentage. Findings that Robert died without clarifying to the realm. But had you done otherwise, the Lannisters' hold would have been all the stronger." He let out a breath. "I will not doubt your loyalty, but I must know, are you prepared to see this through to whatever end? Even if Tywin threatens to burn half the realm to reclaim his daughter and grandson?" Ned straightened, the memory of Joffrey's cruelty burning in his mind. "I am prepared, if it keeps the realm from a false king. I never wanted war, Your Grace, but if war is forced upon us, I will not bend to Lannister tyranny." Stannis studied him, as if measuring each word for truth. "Very well. You have my trust, though it is not something I give lightly. Carry on as you have. Keep the city in order. If Tywin's men approach, we must be ready." He gave a stiff nod, then turned and strode away, cloak rustling behind him. Ned let out a breath. Serving Stannis was like walking a knife's edge. Stannis was every inch a Baratheon in stubbornness, but lacking Robert's warmth. Still, Ned had to admit that at least Stannis was just in his own rigid manner. And so long as Stannis adhered to the rightful laws of the land, Ned would serve him loyally. He spent the next several hours patrolling the Red Keep, meeting with the captains of the watch, ensuring that the men under Janos Slynt, now disgraced and in captivity, had been weeded out or sworn anew. The city was calmer than it had been under Joffrey's tyranny, but tension lingered in the slums of Flea Bottom. Hunger never ceased, and the city's poor had no love for any king. Some small folk believed that the presence of a new monarch meant fresh coin or lenient laws. Others feared more taxes and more cruelty. As Ned walked the ramparts, he watched the crowds below. He saw fewer gold cloaks extorting bribes, fewer random whippings in the street. Perhaps a small sign that something had improved. Yet the city's underlying troubles could not be solved overnight. At mid-afternoon, Ned returned to the castle's interior, his thoughts turning to Sansa. He had not seen her since early morning. After her harrowing experience as Joffrey's would-be bride, Sansa had taken refuge in a set of rooms that once belonged to a lesser lady of the court. Ned climbed the winding steps to find 2 Stark men posted there as guards. They bowed at his approach and allowed him entry. Within, the solar was lit by a tall window, and Sansa stood near it, wearing a pale blue gown that looked slightly too large for her, as though she had lost weight. Her hair, once so carefully styled, hung loose around her shoulders. She turned, and Ned caught the faint shadows under her eyes. But there was a resilience in her face he had not seen a fortnight ago. Her illusions about courtly romance had been shattered, yet it seemed the ruin of those illusions had also forged a new steel in her. "Father," she said, managing a small curtsy, a flicker of the old politeness. "You look tired." Ned stepped forward and gently touched her shoulder. "The burdens of the realm weigh heavily, but I'm managing. How do you fare, my child?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window. The faint breeze stirred a strand of her auburn hair. "I'm relieved, I suppose, Joffrey." Her expression flickered with complicated emotion at the mention of his name. "I know now what kind of boy he is. I'm glad I no longer have to wed him. But it's all still so strange, Father. Sometimes I dream that I'm back in the throne room, and he's smiling at me while ordering people's heads cut off. I wake and have to remember that it's over." Ned's heart constricted. He had been helpless to shield her from those nightmares. "It is over, Sansa. He can't hurt you anymore. He's to take the black or forfeit his life. Stannis has decreed it." She toyed with a corner of her sleeve. "What if he refuses? Will the king truly put him to death?" Ned forced himself to be honest. "Most likely, yes. It's the law, as harsh as that is." Sansa lowered her gaze. "I never wanted him dead. I only wanted him to stop." She swallowed. "I know he was horrible, but I can't help remember how I once thought he was so gallant. How could I have been so blind?" Ned placed a hand on her cheek, gently. "You were a child thrust into a world of cunning and cruelty. Don't blame yourself for believing in songs. And you are hardly the first to be deceived by a Lannister's mask." She nodded, a tear glistening at the corner of her eye. "I try to be strong. I think of Mother and how she would tell me to keep my chin high. I think of Arya and how she'd never let fear stop her." Sansa's voice wavered. "I wish Arya were here." Ned's face tightened with worry. Arya was still missing. By now, he had gleaned that she had escaped the Red Keep the very day of Ned's near execution. A day that had ended differently in this alternate path. Rumors placed her fleeing the city disguised as a boy, or hidden by some group of guards. He had men searching, but the realm was wide, and even Varys's whispers had yet to pinpoint her location. He prayed that the old gods and the new would guide Arya to safety. "She's resourceful," he said softly. "If anyone can take care of herself out there, it's your sister." Sansa offered him a hopeful smile. "I'm sure you're right." He stayed with her a time, speaking of small matters, her dresses, the possibility of returning north once the realm stabilized. A letter from Bran that had arrived at the city's gates. Sansa seized on the mention of her younger brothers. She wanted to know everything, how Bran was faring since his fall, how Rickon was growing. Ned answered as best he could. When he finally took his leave, a calmer expression settled on Sansa's face. He moved on to the next duty, an inspection of Maegor's Holdfast, where Joffrey and Cersei were confined. Ned found a group of Baratheon knights posted at the heavy door. One of them saluted, letting Ned pass. The apartments within were decent, not dungeons, though the windows were barred and guards remained at all exits. When Ned stepped inside, he saw Joffrey in a chair, staring at the wall, wrists unchained for the moment but ringed by black iron manacles at the ankles. A gauntness had crept into his features. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes held a feverish glint of hate. Cersei stood at the far side, her arms folded across her chest, ignoring the presence of several Baratheon men in the corners. Ned spoke quietly to the guard captain. "Has there been any trouble?" The man shook his head. "None, my lord. The boy tries to bait us with insults, and the queen." He glanced warily at Cersei. "Has been sullen, but quiet enough." Ned stepped into the center of the room. His presence drew Joffrey's attention. The boy's eyes narrowed, and his lip curled. "Come to gloat, Stark?" Joffrey spat. "Come to show off your power while I'm chained here like a dog? I should have killed you the day I had the chance." Ned kept his composure. "If you'd had your way, it would have been my head on a spike. We're far from that day now. Have you thought about your decision regarding the Night's Watch?" Joffrey's eyes flickered. "I'd sooner die than swear my life to a pack of rapers and thieves." Cersei whirled, voice seething with bitterness. "Don't speak to him of that. It's barbaric to send a boy, my son, to freeze in the far north among criminals." Ned studied them, feeling an old, wearied ache. "Think on it carefully," he said. "If you refuse the black, King Stannis will carry out the sentence. It's your last chance at life. The life of a man stripped of lands and titles, but a life all the same." Joffrey glowered at him. "I was born a king. Nothing you do will change that." Ned recalled the viciousness in Joffrey's eyes when he had ordered a butcher's boy hunted down, or when he had humiliated Sansa. The memory churned in Ned's stomach, yet Joffrey looked so young in that chair, so pitiful. "You were never the rightful king," Ned said. "You may still keep your head, if you choose to put aside all claims." Cersei opened her mouth to retort, but Ned turned to leave, done with the argument. There was no point in pressing further. He gave the guard captain instructions to keep them secure, to allow Cersei the courtesy of half an hour's walk in the courtyard once a day, escorted by guards, nothing more. Joffrey was to remain indoors. He stepped out and closed the door behind him, the faint echo of Joffrey's curses audible through the stone. That evening, Ned joined Stannis's men in a small courtyard behind the keep, where they practiced archery and swordsmanship by torchlight. He observed as men tested each other with wooden swords, the ring of clacking wood echoing. Stannis himself stood in the shadows, arms folded. Ser Davos approached with the news that he would sail for Bitterbridge on the morrow. The king gave no outward sign of emotion, only a curt order. "Do not fail, do not let Renly claim the Iron Throne." Ned stayed to watch the practice, feeling a quiet pang. If he were in Winterfell, he might be teaching his sons a new sword grip or sparring with Robb. Here, he found himself in a stifling city, forging alliances with men he barely knew. When he finally retired to his chambers, the hours had grown late. He sank into an uneasy sleep filled with fleeting images of Joffrey's mocking grin, Tywin's banners glinting in a field of gold, and Catelyn's voice calling to him from the godswood of Winterfell. He woke before dawn again, driven by that old soldier's habit, and forced down a simple breakfast of bread and milk. A gloom clung to the corridors of the Red Keep, for clouds had rolled in overnight. Rain spattered the windows, muddying the city's cramped streets. Ned pulled on a cloak and made for the Great Hall, where a line of petitioners would gather soon enough. Outside the hall, he encountered Peter Baelish. Littlefinger gave a mocking half-bow, a sardonic smile twitching at his lips. "My Lord Hand, up so early? You'll wear yourself thin." Ned felt only weariness for the man's sly tone. "I've no time for your word games, Baelish." "What do you want?" Littlefinger shrugged. "Only to offer my services. The new King Stannis lacks a master of coin, and the realm's finances remain precarious. I would be happy to advise him as I advised King Robert." Ned eyed him. "You advised Robert into near bankruptcy." "That was Robert's doing," Littlefinger countered lightly. "The man spent coin like water. I merely found the means to keep the crown afloat, patchwork though it was. If not for me, Robert would have had to melt the Iron Throne itself to pay his debts." Ned had no illusions about Littlefinger's cunning, but the realm might indeed need a capable master of coin to stave off disaster. He and Stannis had barely begun to grasp the scale of the crown's debts, especially to the Lannisters. "I'll mention it to the king," Ned said, "though I suspect he'd sooner trust a direwolf around a butcher's block than trust you." Baelish grinned, unoffended. "We shall see." Ned left him mind-churning. He disliked the idea of giving Littlefinger any power, but Stannis might not have many better options at present. Varys, for his part, was a spymaster, not a treasurer. The Tyrells might offer someone if they pledged loyalty, but that alliance was still uncertain. In the Great Hall, a meager crowd of supplicants waited. Merchants with disputes, knights seeking favor, even a few peasants hoping to see the new king or the new hand. It fell to Ned to hear them out, for Stannis had no patience for these minor matters unless they directly involved war or treachery. Ned listened to each petition, trying to remain fair. Some complained of wrongful seizures of property by goldcloaks during Joffrey's rule. Ned promised restitution where possible, though the crown's coin was scarce. Others brought tales of outlaws roaming the Kingswood in the turmoil since Robert's death. Ned took note and directed more watchmen to patrol the roads. As the hours crept by, the throng thinned. Ned Sto. Od to stretch, and that was when a hush fell. An older woman in a threadbare cloak approached, wringing her hands. She sank into a clumsy curtsy before the dais, voice trembling. "My lord, I beg your help. My son was pressed into service by that Slint's men. He never came back. I've been searching and searching. They say he died, but no one can tell me where to find his body. Please, my lord, I just want to bury him proper." A pang of guilt and sorrow seized Ned. The city's chaos under Joffrey and Slint had claimed many unknown lives. "What was your son's name?" "Eric, my lord. Eric from the Street of Flower. He was a good boy. He never did anything wrong." Ned's expression softened. "I'm sorry. Slint is in custody. I will question him. We'll search the rosters of the Watch. If your son's fate is recorded, we'll ensure you have his remains. If not, I promise you we'll do all we can." Tears trickled down the woman's cheeks. "Thank you, my lord. You're kinder than the last one." She tottered away, and Ned felt a knot in his stomach. This was the cost of the city's endless treachery and brutality. He turned to one of the scribes, ordering him to send a query through the Watch's records. Perhaps they would find something. By the time Ned left the Great Hall, it was deep afternoon and still raining, the sky a bleak slate color. He thought again of Winterfell, of how the crisp northern air was harsh yet clean, how the gloom of an overcast day there felt different, purer. King's Landing always seemed to stew in its own filth. On his way down a corridor, he nearly bumped into Varys. The eunuch offered a small bow, hands folded in his sleeves. "Lord Stark, might I trouble you for a brief word?" Ned exhaled. "What is it, Lord Varys?" Varys glanced around, then leaned closer. "I have heard rumors from the city's underbelly that some of the former Goldcloaks, men who served Slint, are hatching a plan to break him from custody. They're said to be meeting at an abandoned tannery near the Hook. If that is so, then your efforts to keep order could be compromised." Ned's eyes narrowed. "And how did you come by this rumor?" Varys's smile was faint and opaque. "Spiders spin many webs, my lord. I simply catch what drifts upon them. I felt it my duty to warn you." Though Ned loathed the spymaster's methods, he did not doubt Varys's skill. "Thank you for the warning. I'll send men to investigate." Varys bowed again. "As you will. I serve the realm, my lord. A stable city is in everyone's interest." With that, the eunuch drifted away. Ned turned sharply on his heel and beckoned one of his guards to follow. He gave quick orders to dispatch a patrol to the rumored hideout, then continued on, each step weighed by the knowledge that any day now, Lannister banners might rise on the horizon, or Renly might declare open defiance, or some new plot might hatch within these very walls. There was no shortage of enemies. Stannis had taken for himself the old royal apartments of King's Landing, from which Robert had once reigned. Ned sought him there to share the new intelligence about Slint's men. The guards outside let him in to find the king seated at a desk littered with parchment, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a pewter cup of watered wine. Stannis was scowling at a document, his candlelit face stern. He glanced up. "More trouble, Stark?" "I fear so. Varys says that men loyal to Slynt plan to break him free. Shall I have Slynt moved to a more secure cell?" Stannis nodded without hesitation. "Yes, Maegor's darkest dungeons, if need be. He will not escape my justice. The man is partly responsible for this city's woes." Ned bowed his head. "As you say, I'll see it done at once." He turned to leave, but Stannis spoke again, voice surprisingly soft. "Stark, do you ever wonder, if the gods are just, why so many unscrupulous men thrive in power while those who try to do right find themselves in an endless struggle?" Ned was taken aback by the question. It was rare for Stannis to betray any hint of introspection or doubt. Carefully, Ned replied, "I have wondered, many times, but I cannot speak for the gods. I only know we must do what we can, with what we have." Stannis gazed at the flickering candle. "Aye, and so we shall." Outside, Ned relayed orders to the captain of the guard to move Janos Slynt to a deeper cell. Men armed with spears and crossbows vanished into the bowels of the Red Keep. Ned then realized he had not eaten since morning, so he paused in the kitchens for a bowl of stew. While he ate, he listened to the scullions' gossip about the changes under the new king. Some of them welcomed Stannis's no-nonsense approach. Others whispered that a little fear might keep them honest, but too much fear would break them. Ned said nothing, only finishing his stew in quiet reflection. Afterward, he stepped outside into the courtyard. The evening damp and cold. The rain had eased to a drizzle. As he passed the corridors near the royal sept, he saw a figure he recognized. Sansa was there, speaking in hushed tones to a young septa. Surprised, Ned approached. He heard Sansa mention prayers for Arya, for Bran and Rickon, for her mother. The septa offered gentle reassurances. Sansa looked up, noticing Ned, her eyes soft with tears. "Father, I was just asking the septa to help me pray for Arya's safe return." Ned's heart twisted. "That is good, my dear," he said quietly. "Keep your faith. Arya has the wolf's blood, as your grandfather used to say. She'll find her way." Sansa nodded. "I know she's out there somewhere. I can feel it." Ned gently squeezed Sansa's shoulder, then led her back toward her rooms. On the way, she confided that she had nightmares of the day in the throne room, of Joffrey shrieking for heads, of the swords drawn, of all the men yelling. Ned told her she was brave, that she had endured something no girl her age should endure. He tried to comfort her by reminding her that she would soon have the choice to return to Winterfell if the roads were safe, or remain in the south as she wished. She gave him a tremulous smile but did not answer. Night deepened, thunder rolling in the distance. Ned realized once again that there would be no real rest for him. The realm lay in precarious balance. If Tywin Lannister advanced from Harrenhal with a large enough force, would Stannis meet him in the field or fortify the city for a siege? And what of Renly, who might rally the lords of Highgarden? A sense of dread settled over Ned. War might come from any direction. A crack of thunder resounded, shaking the windows. Ned blinked away the exhaustion threatening to smother him. He remembered the last war, the grief of losing so many. His father, his brother Brandon, then his sister Lyanna in the Tower of Joy. He remembered the screams, the blood-soaked fields. How much more tragedy would the realm endure? He walked along the ramparts, accompanied by 2 of his loyal men. From up there, he could see the faint glow of the city's lamps. Past the city walls, the black waters of the bay churned under the storm-lashed sky. A gust of salt wind stung his face. No sign of an enemy host yet, but rumors traveled faster than armies. It was said Tywin had called his banners from the Westerlands, men in thousands, and that the mountain Ser Gregor Clegane was raiding the Riverlands anew. Ned's fists clenched. He wanted to ride out and challenge the brutal knight who had murdered children in the name of House Lannister. But he knew he must remain in the capital to keep order. So the days bled into one another. The city braced for what might come. Davos sailed for Bitterbridge to treat with Renly, while Stannis continued to strengthen his hold on the Crownlands. Ravens flitted to and fro, carrying demands, pleas, threats. Ned oversaw the city watch, ensuring the Goldcloaks patrolled fairly, punishing any sign of corruption with swift retribution. The new King's Landing was not gentle, but it was more disciplined. Stannis was a hard man, yet Ned was forced to admit that, thus far, he had kept the city from descending into the terror it had known under Joffrey. Weeks passed. The autumn chill made the nights sharper, though the southern climate remained mild compared to Winterfell's early frosts. Sansa spent many hours in the sept or reading by lamplight, though Ned sometimes saw her in the courtyard, walking uncertainly, arms crossed. Joffrey and Cersei remained sullen prisoners, their presence a looming reminder of the Lannisters' wrath. From time to time, Ned caught glimpses of Cersei being escorted on her daily walk under heavy guard, her golden hair limp, her face contorted with loathing. Joffrey, rumor said, had grown quieter. Some whispered that the boy was beginning to crack under the strain, a caged lion cub turning in circles. One windy morning, a raven arrived from the north, bearing Robb Stark's seal. Ned tore it open immediately, his heart pounding with a father's worry. The words made his throat tighten. Tywin's forces were indeed gathering in the Riverlands. Tension rose between the Tullis and the Lannisters. Hostilities might erupt at any moment. Robb wrote that he was prepared to march south if need be, but he asked for guidance from Ned. Should the North commit to an open war on Stannis' behalf if Tywin advanced on the capital? Ned read and reread Robb's carefully penned words. His son, only a boy of 16, forced to make decisions that could shape the realm. He penned a reply by candlelight urging caution. Wait for a formal request from King Stannis. Watch the movements of the Lannister host. Ned would try to broker a peaceful settlement if possible, but if Tywin insisted on war, the North must stand with the rightful king. As he sealed the parchment, sorrow tugged at him. A father's greatest wish was to keep his child from war's horror. Yet here he was, calling on Robb to prepare. He strode to Stannis' chambers with the letter in hand, intending to share the news. The guards waved him in, and Ned found Stannis bent over a map of the Crownlands. A pair of knights hovered by the door, but the king waved them away to give Ned privacy. "Lord Stark," Stannis said, not looking up, "you have news." Ned passed him Robb's letter. Stannis scanned it, his eyes dark with concentration. So Tywin truly musters for war. He set the parchment aside. "My scouts tell me the same. He's at Harrenhal now with half his strength. The other half is to the west, near the Golden Tooth. If he chooses to march on King's Landing, the city might face a host of 20,000 or more." Ned's heart sank. The Red Keep's walls were formidable, but a siege that large could starve the city. 20,000. We have what, half that number here under your banner? Perhaps less. Stannis' mouth tightened. We have more if we count the city watch, but the watch is not an army. Our best hope might be to hold out behind the walls until the North can join us. Or we meet Tywin on the open field before he reaches the gates. A risk either way. Ned thought of the small folk, the thousands trapped in the city. A siege would send them starving, frantic, perhaps fueling riots. I'll do what I can to gather grain reserves, keep the peace. But if there's any chance to avoid this fight, Stannis' gaze hardened. I sent terms to Tywin. He demanded Cersei and Joffrey's release, full amnesty, and a regency in the name of Tommen Baratheon, another of Cersei's children. Unacceptable. The Lannisters still pretend that these bastards are Robert's issue. I refuse to cede the throne to them. He set his jaw. We will not yield. Ned nodded slowly. He understood that giving Tywin any measure of control would open the door for the Lannisters to seize power once more. Then we prepare for war. It was a bitter conclusion, but likely an inevitable one. Ned left the king's presence with a troubled spirit, ordering the city to begin storing grains in the keep, urging the blacksmiths to forge more weapons, quietly funneling resources to wherever the city's defenses needed strengthening. Over the next few days, wagons of grain arrived from Rosby and Stokeworth. Ned personally oversaw the distribution, mindful that unscrupulous men might line their pockets. He wanted no repeat of the corruption that had flourished under Joffrey. A few days later, fresh commotion rippled through the Red Keep. A delegation from Highgarden had arrived at the city gates, accompanied by the banners of House Tyrell. They were granted entry with some caution, each man's weapon inspected. Ned stood in the courtyard with a group of Baratheon men to receive them. He recognized the golden rows of Highgarden sewn upon their surcoats. At their head rode Ser Loras Tyrell, the famed Knight of Flowers. With him was Lord Mathis Rowan and several lesser lords from the Reach. Ser Loras dismounted gracefully, removing his helm to reveal his comely face and thick brown locks. He inclined his head to Ned, who was effectively acting as Stannis's hand. "Lord Stark, I come on behalf of my Lord Father, Mace Tyrell, to treat with King Stannis." Ned returned the greeting, politely but without warmth. He remembered that the Tyrells had once thrown their lot in with Renly when he proclaimed himself king in the books, or with Joffrey if the alliance favored them. Their loyalty shifted with opportunity. "The king will see you. Follow me." They walked inside. The Tyrell knights left their arms behind under close watch, and Ser Loras was escorted to the audience chamber where Stannis waited. The new king stood on the dais before the Iron Throne, wearing a simple dark doublet with the flaming heart sigil. Guards flanked him. Ned took up position at Stannis' side, arms folded, as Ser Loras advanced, kneeling. "Your Grace," Loras said, voice steady. "Lord Mace Tyrell sends his warm regards. He regrets that events have kept him from traveling here himself. He wishes to discuss terms for the Reach's allegiance." Stannis' mouth curved into a slight frown. "Your father hesitated long in pledging to any side. He once supported Joffrey, unless I'm mistaken." Loras managed to keep his composure. "That was before certain truths came to light, Your Grace." "Truths about Joffrey's parentage, you mean?" Stannis said. "Then you do not dispute my rightful claim?" "No, Your Grace. If you recognize the Tyrell's dominion over the Reach and grant certain considerations, we will pledge our swords to your reign. My father asks that you put aside all claims of wrongdoing in supporting Joffrey. We believed him Robert's son." Stannis studied Loras coldly. "And what of Renly? Does your father champion his cause?" Loras glanced at Ned, then back to Stannis. "There have been rumors, Your Grace, that Lord Renly still musters men. My father has no desire to stand against the lawful king. But it's no secret that some among the Reach prefer Renly. He is, after all, charismatic. If you desire the Tyrells' full support, you must consider alliances." Stannis' jaw tightened. "Alliances such as Mace Tyrell's daughter? Marjorie, perhaps?" Ned saw a flicker of surprise in Loras' eyes. Clearly, Stannis was not naive. "Yes, Your Grace. My sister could be wed to you, uniting House Baratheon and House Tyrell. Powerful bond. The realm would see it as a new dawn after the storms that have battered us." Stannis glanced aside, expression impassive. "I am already wed, Ser Loras. I have a queen, Lady Celis." An awkward hush fell. Ned recalled Stannis' dour, pious wife, Celis of House Florent, not a woman of great beauty or influence, overshadowed by the Tyrells. Loras bowed his head. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I only repeat my father's words." He wondered if circumstances might allow for the dissolution of that union, or if you might consider other bonds. "He means no offense." Stannis' face darkened. "He means every offense. But I will not stand on ceremony. Tell your father, I will not cast aside my lawful wife. If the Tyrells wish to join the rightful king, they may do so without demanding I betray my vows." His voice rang across the chamber. "As for their previous support of a false king, I am not blind to the realm's need for unity. I am prepared to grant them pardon and maintain their rights in the Reach if they swear fealty to me openly and send their banners to fight any who would challenge my reign. That includes my brother Renly, if he persists." Ser Loras hesitated. "My father will ask for something more tangible, Your Grace. Perhaps you might name Marjorie a princess of the realm in some capacity, or offer a betrothal to your nephew. Something that cements our houses together. The Tyrells will not stand idly by while others shape the realm's future. Ned observed Stannis carefully. The king's face betrayed only a flicker of impatience. We shall see. First let the Tyrell banners ride to our aid against the Lannisters, or Renly if need be. Then I will consider such requests. Let us not put the cart before the horse. Loras inclined his head stiffly. I will relay your words, your grace. Stannis looked at Ned. Lord Stark, see that Ser Loras and his retinue are housed comfortably. Then return to me. I have further matters to discuss. Ned nodded and escorted Loras away, guiding him and his men to a set of airy chambers near the keep's outer wall. On the way, Loras made polite conversation, but Ned perceived the frustration underlying his courtly manners. The Tyrells wanted a marriage alliance, something more binding than Stannis's grudging acceptance. For all their talk of loyalty, Ned suspected they simply wanted the best vantage for power in the new order. They parted ways at the door, and Ned headed back to Stannis. On the walk, he passed Cersei Lannister being escorted in her daily courtyard stroll under watchful guard. She glared at him with open contempt. For a heartbeat, Ned wondered if part of her scorn was fueled by the irony that the realm now prepared for war not only with Lannisters but possibly with Renly, while she and Joffrey languished as captives. The Game of Thrones was never straightforward. Stannis was waiting in the same chamber. He paced by the window, fists clenched behind his back, the light of late afternoon bathing him in muted gold. The king hardly acknowledged Ned's arrival, continuing to stare at the yard below. Finally, he spoke. These Tyrells are a nuisance, he said. They sniff about seeking advantage. They want a crown for Marjorie, or for one of their brood. And yet we need them. If Tywin marches, the Tyrell host could tip the balance in our favor. If they spurn me or decide to follow Renly. He trailed off, then exhaled sharply. Your thoughts, Stark? Ned paused. They want to be certain they're not backing the losing side. That's their way. But if we show strength, if we demonstrate that we can hold against the Lannisters, perhaps they'll come around. Renly may promise them more. A betrothal, a crown for Marjorie, a seat on the small council. He's cunning in his own way, and the Tyrells love pageantry. True, Ned conceded, but we still have Joffrey and Cersei as hostages. Tywin can't move too rashly. We may have time to turn the Tyrells to our side. Stannis turned from the window. Ser Davos should reach Renly soon. We shall see if my brother cedes his pretensions. I doubt it. His gaze skewered Ned. And in the north, your son stands ready to ride? Ned met his eye. If the Lannisters strike, yes, Robb will ride. But the north is not eager for war. We remember the cost from Robert's rebellion. Stannis frowned. We have no choice. Law and order must be enforced. Ned he out of breath. The day's tension weighed on him. We will do what must be done, he said quietly. Days trickled by in a slow churn of political maneuvering and readiness. Ned rode the city streets, visiting the gatehouses, the granaries. He listened to small folks' gripes. He urged the Watch to remain vigilant against infiltration by Lannister sympathizers. He wrote repeated letters to Robb, to the Tullis at Riverrun, seeking updates. Meanwhile, ravens arrived bearing tidings of skirmishes in the Riverlands, plundered villages attributed to Gregor Clegane. The name made Ned's hand clench reflexively around his sword hilt. The mountain had to be stopped, but Stannis was reluctant to send troops to chase raiders when Tywin's main host might appear at any moment. Then, one damp morning, a breathless courier arrived at the Red Keep's gates, demanding to see Ned Stark. He claimed to hail from Davos Seaworth's ship. Ned brought him into a small council room, and Stannis joined them, along with a handful of guards. The courier, soaked from rain, fell to one knee. Your Grace, he said between gasps. Lord Stark, Ser Davos sends urgent word from Bitterbridge. Lord Renly has declared himself king of the Seven Kingdoms. He has the support of a large portion of the Reach, including House Tyrell. They've crowned him with a circlet of golden roses. Ser Davos tried to. He tried. Stannis's face went stiff. Go on. The courier swallowed. Ser Davos was refused audience with Renly after presenting your grace's terms. The lords of the Reach have pledged their swords to Renly's cause. He's marching north, they say, but uncertain whether he aims for King's Landing or to intercept Tywin. The Storm Lords, many have sided with him. Ser Davos warns that they are a formidable host. Silence pounded in the room like a drum. Ned felt a cold pit in his stomach. So that was the Tyrells' game. They had humored negotiations with Stannis, but behind the scenes they crowned Renly. The realm was fractured further. Now 3 men claimed the throne. Joffrey, though deposed, Stannis and Renly. A sundered land and Ned in the middle of it. Stannis closed his eyes, a tremor visible in his jaw. Then he snapped them open, the fury in his gaze molten. So my brother would wage war upon me, upon the rightful king, while a Lannister army gathers. Madness. He turned on his heel, slamming his fist against the table. He has always craved attention, but this defies all sense. Davos must be kept safe. Tell me, courier, is Davos all right? The courier nodded rapidly. He slipped away, your grace. He said he'd return by sea and would rejoin you soon. But he bade me ride ahead to bring the news. Stannis was silent a moment, fists clenched at his sides, eyes burning. So be it, he said at last, voice hoarse with frustration. Renly would tear the realm apart for his vanity. He will force me to meet him on the field, unless Tywin strikes first. Ned spoke carefully. What do we do? If Renly marches on King's Landing, we must defend it. If Tywin does the same, we face 2 armies. Stannis nodded bleakly. 2 armies, yes, and I have but one. We must hope they turn on each other, or that the gods themselves intervene. In the meantime, I will call for more men from Dragonstone and the loyal Storm Lords. We fortify the city. If Renly tries to take it, he will find it well defended. If Tywin arrives at the same time, he exhaled. A siege from 2 fronts would be the end. Ned's mind whirled. They might be trapped in the city, hammered by Renly and Tywin alike. He thought of Joffrey and Cersei sitting in the tower, ironically safe from the chaos they had unleashed. We can only prepare as best we can, he said quietly. Stannis glared at the map on the wall, as though it might yield solutions by force of will. Very well. We shall call another war council, muster every last resource. Lord Stark, you remain hand in all but name. I will rely on you to keep order within these walls. I have no illusions. This will be a war on multiple fronts. We must trust that the North, and perhaps the Riverlands, will stand with me against the Lannisters, that the Tyrells who remain unaligned might yet see sense, and that the Storm Lords not all flock to Renly's banner. Ned nodded, though his stomach felt hollow. This was worse than he had feared. The realm was splintering. If any part of the great houses smelled advantage, they might join either claimant or carve out territory for themselves. And in the chaos, small folk would suffer most. They dismissed the courier, who shuffled away under a guard's guidance. Ned lingered a moment. Your Grace, is there truly no chance of bridging the rift with Renly? You are both Baratheons. You share the same blood. Must it come to steel? Stannis's expression was like stone. He named himself king while I yet live. He spat on my rights as Robert's heir. Do you truly think he would yield after crowning himself? This is not about family. It's about the throne. The law is clear. I am the rightful king, and those who deny it betray the realm. He leaves me no choice. Ned said nothing more. He bowed and left. The storm outside had grown, the wind rattling shutters and sending rain streaming in rivulets down the castle walls, a perfect reflection of the turmoil inside. As he walked, a swirl of regrets haunted him. If only Robert had lived, if only Ned had uncovered the truth of Joffrey's parentage sooner, if only Cersei had fled as he once urged her. Now it all ended in fracturing alliances and half the realm ready to fight the other half. And this, presumably, was what Ned had hoped to prevent when he dared stage that coup. Instead, it merely set the stage for further battles. But at least the rightful king sat the throne, not a bastard boy with madness in his eyes. That night, Ned and Sansa shared a brief supper in Ned's solar. She picked at her food, gazed distant. He asked her gently if she wanted to leave King's Landing, to travel north under guard. But Sansa shook her head, tears brimming. "I can't leave you here alone, father. Robb is far away. Arya is out there somewhere. Mother is in the Riverlands. If you stay, I stay. I can't bear the thought of losing more family." Ned felt a well of gratitude and sorrow. Sansa had grown in these terrible weeks. Gone was the naive girl who dreamed of fair-haired princes and songs of courtly love. He took her hand across the table. "I would keep you safe, my child, but I will not force you. If you wish to remain, you may. Just know that dark days may be coming." She nodded, voice trembling. "Dark or light, I'll stand with you." He pressed her hand gently, wishing he could shield her from the world. But he could only trust that the gods had some plan. That night, the thunder shook the city, and the wind howled through the alleys. King's Landing braced itself for the storms of war. Sure enough, word came within days that Renly had advanced as far as Tumbleton, forging alliances with more lords of the Reach. Meanwhile, Tywin seemed content to remain at Harrenhal for the moment, perhaps consolidating his forces or waiting to see if Renly and Stannis might weaken each other first. The tension pressed upon the city like a physical weight. Markets grew sparse. Prices rose. The small folk muttered about the possibility of famine or siege. Among Stannis's closest advisors, talk of strategy turned urgent. Some urged the king to march out and attack Renly before he could form a pincer with Tywin. Others counseled a more cautious approach, waiting to see if Tywin struck at Renly's rear. The risk of leaving King's Landing unprotected was great, especially with Lannister forces in the Riverlands. Through it all, Ned pressed for any resolution that might spare the city a ruinous siege. But Stannis stood unwavering. If Renly marched on King's Landing, Stannis would meet him in battle rather than open the gates to a usurper. As the threat of war loomed, Joffrey finally cracked in his cell. One afternoon, as Ned was completing his rounds of the watch, a guard came running with frantic news. Joffrey had attacked one of the guards, wresting a dagger from him and slashing wildly, screaming that he was the true king and that all would kneel or die. The guard took a wound to the arm but subdued him. Now the boy was in chains, raving. Cersei wept and shrieked that the guard had provoked him. But the men confirmed it was Joffrey who started it, trying to carve a path to freedom. Ned hurried to the holdfast, finding the corridors crowded with guards, swords half drawn. Within, Joffrey knelt on the floor, shackled so tightly he could barely move, breathing raggedly. The guard he'd attacked was being tended by a maester, blood seeping through the bandages on his forearm. Cersei hovered in the corner, pale with fury and fear. When she saw Ned, she spat in his direction. "This is your fault, Stark. You've driven him mad with your vile captivity." Ned said nothing to her ravings. He looked at Joffrey, who glared back, foam visible at the corners of his mouth. The boy's voice was hoarse from screaming. "I'll kill you," he whispered. "I'll kill you all. I'm the king. I'm the king." Ned instructed the guards to keep him in irons. Joffrey had refused the night's watch, but soon enough Stannis would no longer wait. The boy's mania could not be allowed to fester. Once again, Ned was forced to face how precarious the entire situation was. A dethroned boy king, a furious queen mother, a rightful king forced to defend against two major threats to his reign. And all the while, the common folk suffered. Days later, the horns sounded from the city walls. A host approached, banners sighted along the Gold Road. Ned's heart leapt with fear that Tywin had finally come. But the riders proved to be a smaller force, 3,000 men under the banner of House Tarly, apparently marching to join Renly. They skirted the capital, making no attack, heading southeast. King's Landing was left untouched, for now, but the message was clear. More allies flocked to Renly. Soon, he would have a force large enough to threaten the city in earnest. In a council meeting that evening, Stannis' face was thunderous. He demanded to know how so many lords of the Reach could ignore the lawful claim of the elder Baratheon. Lord Mathos, representing Storm's End, tried to placate him, but the king was beyond patience. Ned stood by, silent, knowing all too well that courtesy rarely triumphed over ambition in King's Landing. That night, as Ned lay awake in his chambers, the torches guttering in the corridor, he felt a deep ache of foreboding. When he closed his eyes, he saw the capital under siege. Flames licking at the gates, the shrieks of terrified small folk, Sansa cowering in a corner, and soldiers in the Baratheon Stag and the Tyrell Rose clashing in the streets. War seemed inevitable. Even if he had saved the realm from Joffrey's immediate tyranny, the price might be a vast conflict that consumed the entire South. Morning brought no relief. The clouds hung low, and the air felt close. Ned walked the ramparts, scanning the horizon. Below, the city sprawled in all its tumultuous glory. The rooflines, the winding alleys, the black water of the river beyond. He spotted the outlines of some of Stannis's men drilling in the yard, for discipline was a word the new king spoke often. The city watch was more organized now, wearing a new sigil, Stannis's Stag, rather than the old golden cloaks. Still, Ned worried about their loyalty if the city came under a massive assault. A presence at his shoulder startled him. He turned to see Varys, hands folded, gazing out over the battlements. "Lord Stark," Varys said softly, "I sense your worry." Ned offered no immediate reply. He no longer bothered to hide his mistrust of the spymaster. But in these times, Varys was as close to an ally as any in the shadows. "Hard not to worry with two armies on our doorstep." Varys bowed his head. "Indeed, the realm stands at a precipice. Tywin Lannister to the north and west, Renly Baratheon to the south, each with cause to seize King's Landing. Our new king stands in the middle, and the small folk cower under the threat of war. It is a pity, truly." Ned studied him. "Do you have some counsel, Lord Varys, or do you merely state what we all know?" Varys's lips curved in a small smile. "I offer only the reminder that, at times, subtlety and compromise can achieve what armies cannot. Renly is, after all, King Stannis's brother. Perhaps there is some path to reconciliation. Failing that, perhaps the city might arrange an outcome that spares needless bloodshed." Ned's voice hardened. "Meaning what, exactly?" Varys spread his hands. "Meaning that a single dagger in the dark could slay more hopes than 1,000 swords in the field. If the rightful king or the so-called king were struck down at a vulnerable moment, it might change the course of events. I do not speak of murder lightly, my lord, but we are in King's Landing, a city built on such solutions." Ned felt revulsion twist in his gut. "I will not stoop to assassination. I'm no Lannister, nor do I believe King Stannis would condone such a thing." Varys nodded, unruffled. "As you say. Still, the realm's interest may not always align with the king's personal sense of honor. I only serve the realm, Lord Stark. I do hope we can avoid the bloodshed of tens of thousands. Good day." He bowed slightly and left, his footsteps unnervingly soft on the stone walkway. Ned stared after him, hands tightening on the cold rampart. He hated that part of his mind recognized the logic. If Renly fell to an assassin's blade, his host might crumble. If Tywin were struck down, the Lannister armies might lose direction. But that was not justice. That was the spider's way. Ned refused to consider it, no matter how desperate the situation. He visited Sansa again, trying to show a calm face, though inside he was a storm of doubts. She seemed to sense the tension. He assured her that no assault had begun yet, that they had the city well guarded. But as the days wore on, no messenger arrived with good news. Instead, more dire tidings filtered in. Renly had gained the allegiance of House Redwine's fleet. Tywin was forging alliances with the Freys. The Martells of Dorne remained silent, but rumor said they might strike at any side if it benefited them. War in the south looked unstoppable. Finally, on a day that dawned strangely bright, Ser Davos Seaworth returned to the city by ship, battered by storms but alive. Ned was present when Davos met Stannis in the courtyard. falling to one knee despite his bruises and weather-worn appearance. His expression was bleak. "Your Grace, my worst fears were confirmed. Renly refuses any terms. He claims your birthright was dissolved when you allowed the Lannisters to occupy the throne, though it was not your doing, we know. He says you are unfit to rule and that the realm cries out for a young, bold king." Stannis's jaw clenched. Bold as a pup yapping at a grown hound. Very well. He chooses war. Davos nodded sorrowfully. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I tried to reason with them." Stannis placed a hand on Davos's shoulder. "You did what you could, old friend." Then he turned to Ned, who stood nearby with a sinking heart. "Lord Stark, summon the War Council. We'll plan our defense. If Renly tries to take King's Landing by storm, I will greet him with steel." Ned inhaled slowly. "Yes, Your Grace." He thought of Catelyn, of how she had always yearned for peace, how she had lost so much in war already. But events had outrun them all. In the days to come, King's Landing would become the center of a gathering maelstrom. Joffrey's downfall had spared the realm from one tyrant, but now the throne was contested by warring factions, each convinced they had the right to rule. So Ned would do his duty, as he always had, praying that the cost of this war did not break the Seven Kingdoms beyond repair. And far in the distance, the thunderheads rumbled, harbingers of the greater storms yet to break upon these shores. Ned Stark tightened the belt at his waist, steeling himself for the battles that lay ahead, on the fields and in council chambers, in whispered conspiracies and open declarations. He had chosen the path of honor when he staged that coup, dethroning a false king. Now, honor demanded he stand fast against the realm's new threats, no matter the toll. The final shape of the Seven Kingdoms lay hidden in the gloom of tomorrow, and all Ned Stark could do was stand firm under the swirling clouds, ready to do his duty until his final breath.